parents. I already started, I'm sorry. So this is my 50 parents at the Bergen Exchanges. And one thing I know, it's one thing to be late starting, but we have to end on time. So in the interest of sort of having an hour, I'm actually going to start. So welcome back from lunch. I hope you had a nice break. My name is Lise Rakner. I am a professor of comparative politics at the University of Bergen. I'm also an affiliate researcher at the Christian Michelsen Institute, and I lead one of the units of the Center for Law and Social Transformation, the unit that's called Democracy and Law. And I've been very lucky to chair a panel on political corruption, and that's what we will be talking about for the next hour. Political corruption is defined very narrowly in the sense as the use of public office for personal gain. I think we all sort of know what it looks like. I mean, I don't know how many films you've seen about machine politics in the States. I don't know how many stories you've heard from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia about electoral officials being bribed, parties being bribed, and you know how politics is run by money. Just a blatant stealing of public money. So getting into office is the surest way to get rich. One of the most famous cases, for instance, being the so-called cash gate in Malawi, where you actually had politicians just carrying stacks of money out of their offices. These are like the blatant examples of political corruption. What we are going to talk about today, and we'll have three presentations about, is we'll discuss issues that I'm hoping that you will bring up in your questions, is that how does this affect democracy? And how does these claims of, the fact that we see politicians using an office for personal gain, how does that affect legitimacy and the very fabric of the institutions on which democracy relies? These are some of the sort of broad general topics that we will talk about. We'll also get into how your claims of political corruption can be used as a very good tool to get rid of a political enemy. And how when claims of corruption is used, that could be very timely. There's also a lot of recent research that I'm not sure we'll be able to get into, but maybe if I get a question, I can talk about it. It is to what extent political corruption is gendered. To what extent are female politicians more punished for actions or perceived actions of corruption than men? That's another relatively new research area that it would be interesting to talk about. And because we've been lucky with this panel and the composition of this panel, and because of the country we're in and the countries that we will be presenting, I also want us to reflect on what is it about countries endowed with large extractive industries and large national resources. Why are these countries particularly, perhaps, prone and vulnerable to corruption? And so those are some of the themes that we will be touching on. However, just stay awake and be alert, because I've given these guys a pretty free rein, and they've given some time, and they are allowed to talk about their pet subject. So in this panel, hopefully then, even though I've given you free rein, I'm sort of hoping that we will stick somewhere to the agenda that I thought. And that is, so we will start with Conrado Hubner Mendez, who is a law professor from the University of Sao Paulo. He's also an avid political commentator in Brazil. I think I've just learned that you have a weekly op-ed where you comment on political developments in Brazil. He will take us into some of the more large, overarching corruption stories, but he has also promised us that it's a happy story. So this I'm really quite excited about. The next person on my panel is sitting right next to me, Landilani Banda, who's a lawyer from Zambia. He is right now doing his PhD, and he's part of this as a PhD student at the University of Pretoria. And he specializes on human rights law and medical law, and he's really, one of his key subjects is how the law can protect and also actually be used against vulnerable populations. He is also an advocate in the High Court of Zambia, and he's super brave, I have to say. He has defended cases that a lot of other lawyers would not defend, of fear of their reputation and their jobs. And he was actually voted as in a Zambian newspaper last year, as one of the few promising people in terms of democratic developments. There were 5 people mentioned, and you were one of them. This is a huge country. I really want to give you a round of applause. And it's also a country facing huge democratic challenges, so that is very brave and very important. Finally, and not least, we have Mark Robinson on the panel. He has very recently become a Norwegian. He is from Britain, but he has, since 2018, been the executive director of the Extractive Industries and Transparency Initiative, which he will talk a little bit more about, EITI, which is located in Oslo. And he is our expert on this panel, and the one we expect the most from, in terms of talking about this thing about how extractive industries and natural resources actually make countries more vulnerable to political corruption. So I'm sort of hoping for some insights on that one. On the other side, he is also a political scientist, like me, and we've known each other for 30 years, something like that. So you have a great knowledge of governance and issues of climate and climate governance. And so, there's a lot of things that we can reflect on and a lot of possibilities for great answers. That was my introduction. Now I give the floor to you. And I am very much looking forward to the happy story.
Thank you very much, Lisa. I'm not sure I was very sincere in promising a happy story.
Maybe you were cynical.
It was actually a bad joke. But I'm sure it is a very colorful story and a very picturesque story. And that's why I don't usually use PowerPoints, but today I decided to have a PowerPoint presentation. I will tell basically the story of a very multifaceted and large 5-year story. With many chapters, I will be selective. I want to highlight the portions of this story that are relevant for this panel. And I will start the story. Of course, that courts have been the epicenter of the Brazilian political crisis, of every single episode from at least 2013 onwards. And this story, the Lava Jato story, the car wash operation story, is really have a whole set of courts at the epicenter as protagonists of this. And the story, I will start the story by, once upon a time, 2 well-intentioned and law-abiding young men who happened to be a judge and a prosecutor in Curitiba, a city in Paraná, came across the case of their lives. And they have changed the course of Brazilian history. Very summarized version of what the scheme was about, what they discovered, what came to their table. Basically, a cartel of construction companies shared overpriced contracts with Petrobras, the biggest state oil company of Brazil. Odebrecht was the leading one, but 9 other companies. The second component is part of the overpricing money was channeled to Petrobras executives. And then financial operators channeled and laundered the money to major political parties. This is considered to be the largest foreign bribery case in history, in the history of Western democracy. This was a sentence by the Department of Justice of US, The Guardian and many other newspapers estimated the size of this story as a really humongous story. So the expectation, the Guardian basically summarized sort of the skepticism around the car wash. In the long term, many still hope car wash will ultimately make Brazil a fairer, more efficient nation run by cleaner, law-abiding politicians. But there is also a risk that the operation will shake the country's fragile democracy to the ground and clear the way for a right-wing evangelical theocracy or a return to rule by dictators. This was 2017. but actually 2018 told us a different story. So I'll tell you something about the rise and fall, what I think is a fall, but I'm not sure is a fall, of the two protagonists of this story. They are important. They are perhaps the two main protagonists through which we can tell a really nice story. These are the two really virtuous white young men. This is Sergio Moro. This is Deltan Dallagnol. Sergio Moro, they have both become a really political figure in Brazil. Sergio Moro, for example, he was having really nice social occasions with all the big political opposition of Brazil. This is Aécio Neves, the former candidate for presidency who Dilma defeated in 2014. This is Michel Temer, who received the presidency after she was impeached. This is Alckmin. This is Serra. This is Rondônia, perhaps our next president. This is Bloomberg, the only non-Brazilian man. They were celebrating in New York. Moro has been celebrated all over the place as a sort of national hero. He's been speaking in Notre Dame graduation ceremony. He's been all over the place. Columbia University, American Academy of Arts, Wilson Center, and etc. Moro has been on the cover of many magazines. The Brazilian of the Year, 2017. This is just one of a bunch of covers. And this is a really nice statement by Moro. He's basically, after convicting Lula on that very specific case of an apartment, etc., you probably know, he's basically saying as a judge, still as a judge, Lula is the mentor of the whole criminal scheme of Petrobras. The triplex is just the tip of the iceberg. The triplex was the only case Lula had been convicted for at that time, right? This is Moro, a really big political figure, and we will see a little bit why. This is the team of the Lava Jato task force, led by Dallagnol. I won't say much about this picture, but you can draw your own conclusions. This is the big crusader against corruption in the country. He wrote books. He proposed an important bill, 10 measures against corruption. He had a sort of overall solution for corruption in the country, but he has not only been fighting against corruption inside the courts, he has also been preaching in churches. We are all united against corruption. He has always also been giving lectures to banks, really well-paid lectures in banks, and talking about ethics in business, talking about how corruption should be addressed, and so on. And they have both become protagonists of a Netflix series in Brazil, The Mechanism. It is a fictionalized version of what happened, very, very distorted, but anyway, it was based on Lava Jato. There are several very picturesque episodes of the many operations in Lava Jato. So there were several search and warrants and arrests, pre-trial arrests. So pre-trial detentions, really big businessmen and politicians. Just to have an idea, just those pictures that are important for showing, for themselves, for showing what the good they are doing for the country. The whole task force gave at least weekly interviews, collective interviews. They have the routine for explaining and addressing and actually describing what was happening in every single episode of the operation. And then there are sometimes some exaggeration. This PowerPoint slide has become the most famous PowerPoint slide in history, probably, because PowerPoint slides are not supposed to be famous, but this one has really become a sort of design model for many things, for jokes and for adaptations, etc. But actually, what he's wanting to describe here is what Dallagnol by himself called propinocracy. This is basically bribe bureaucracy, a neologism that he created to basically publicly show a lot of conviction, not necessarily evidences. And Lula, of course, was the chief master of the propinocracia. Lula, in March 2016, was sort of subject of what we call coercive testimonial. Much earlier in the process, he never refused to go to court to give his testimony, but this was a really theatrical. The Moro asked the police to take him from home, and it was a really big public event. And these pictures have a really symbolic weight. More or less on the same week, Moro has illegally leaked conversation that were wiretapped between Lula and Dilma. And this directly interfered in Dilma's plan to appoint Lula at that time as a minister. Weeks later, this is the picture which politically has nothing to do with Lava Jato, or legally has nothing to do with Lava Jato, but politically has everything to do with Lava Jato. Basically, the sign is telling, bye-bye, my dear. This is a picture of the Chamber of Congress. The Chamber approves the impeachment charge against President Dilma, April 2016. And basically, this is the sentence against Lula, which comes in July 17, and by a record timing, the confirmation by the district court, which was important for Lula to be arrested, came 6 months earlier, or later, sorry. This is the most iconic picture of Lula's goodbye to his base in January 2018. He was about to go to Curitiba, where he has been since then. And here I have 5 more minutes, and I will just summarize a few things. Sergio Moro should be interpreted. He wrote a paper in 2004 talking about the mani puliti in Italy. He basically says that public opinion is essential to the success of an anti-corruption lawsuit. But the next sentence is more indicative. What he means by democracy and public opinion. Perhaps the most important lesson of the whole episode is that prosecution against corruption is effective only with the support of democracy. It is this who defines the limits and possibilities of the lawsuit. And then comes what he understands by democracy. As long as it has the support of public opinion, it can move forward and deliver good results. 3 exemplary acts of judicial abuse, I think. First, I already mentioned, Moro leaked Lula's coercive testimony, and then later in 2018, among many other things, Moro made public a plea bargain testimony which was basically rubbish 5 days before the election of Bolsonaro. Lava Jato by numbers. I don't have to say that there are huge numbers about number of convicted people, years of prison time, plea bargains, etc. Months later, he becomes the man of the president. Although he promised months earlier he would never accept an invitation by any president, because that, he rightly said, that would compromise, would turn it questionable, the image and the integrity of the whole operation. This is people on the streets defending Lava Jato. Lava Jato becomes a national cause for really right-wing or actually opposition to PT government. The Superman, you know who it is. Here's the Superman more clearly. he already as a minister becomes a sort of guarantor of Bolsonaro government moderation. That was the expectation at the moment of his appointment. As well, at least, let's see whether Moro is the guardian of the rule of law. And then the fall, really quickly. The dirty residue. All the suspicions about the coordination between judge and prosecutor, and much more, were revealed by the Intercept leaks. The covers start changing the mud. So this is Moro desmoronando, which is falling apart. Here is Dallagnol. Here is Moro again, a bit naked. The Superman becomes naked. And here is Glenn Greenwald, sort of turning the story in several episodes of leaks of their messages in Telegram. So these are serious episodes, and I will mention just one, perhaps, of their exchanges, of months and months of exchanges. So what I will highlight here is Moro telling the prosecutor, maybe tomorrow you should prepare a press release explaining the contradiction between his testimony. This was the moment Lula gave his testimony, between his testimony and the rest of the evidence, or with his previous testimony. And then this was an important one between Dallagnol and Moro, again, discussing what sort of sentence Moro was about to give, what sort of approach Dallagnol should have regarding the press, what sort of arguments Moro should use or not, what sort of arguments Dallagnol should use or not, by telegram. And even this, which I thought is grotesque, they planned a leak for helping Venezuelan people fight against corruption, regarding Odebrecht and etc. So they even had the ambition of interfering in Venezuelan democracy. This is, I'm sorry, I will change here. There are many readings and perspectives on Lava Jato. Of course, the political, whether this is a partisan or non-partisan one, use legal or illegal instruments. There are discussions about the design of the criminal law, lots of breaches of professional ethics, whether this is harmful or not. This exceptionalist regime was harmful or not for institutionality, whether this destabilized completely the party system. But I will highlight just a couple of legacies I think should be highlighted regarding the car wash. First, the emergence of car washism ideology. This is a sort of legal exceptionalism which accepts very weak standards of proof and heterodox investigation strategies. This has led the public, or the Brazilian public sphere, to a very binary straitjacket. You are either for Lava Jato or you are a partner of corruption. This has led us to a terrible phenomenon of judicial populism. The judiciary starts fighting against a big cause, not deciding case by case, but fighting for moralizing, for cleaning up, this is the metaphor they use, for cleaning up Brazilian politics. This allows for judicial corruption, and we should use this word for everything is happening in Bolsonaro. They are fighting for a greater cause, so small violations of legal guarantees are more than justified in light of a greater cause. There is a very misleading virtue of judicial heroism, this idea of an infallible judge that cannot break the law, because what he says is the law, so I have the power of fiat lex. I say what the law is, and if I say I'm respecting the law, it's because I'm respecting the law. And then, more deeply, it's fueled a very anti-politics, especially anti-left sentiment that still nurtures a blind eye towards corruption across the political spectrum. Had much more to say, but I'll stop here. Sorry.
I'm glad you took a little bit of time, because this is this incredibly complex story, and it really sort of, like, back to the very simplistic notion of what is political corruption, personal gain of political office. This just shows how much more complex it is, and how much more, how many nuances, and how difficult this is. But I think one of the things that I really, just want to pick up on, and I know you will have questions later on, is this term that I think that is new to me, but I think judicial populism, and how you have people above the institution. That's just really, that is really fascinating. So thank you so much. I know, just keep your questions. Landilani, I don't exactly know what you want to tell us about corruption in Zambia. To what extent it correlates, or do you see a difference? But I mean, and it doesn't have to correlate, because you have your story. So now you have your 10 minutes.
What I have observed is that corruption manifests itself differently in different contexts, but its nature is still very much the same. Is that it will breed inequalities, it will undermine social movements. Now, I want to start my story with three very important questions, or what I see as three very important questions. And the first is, why historically has it been that most African governments or most African political leaders cling on to power? That's a very important question to consider. Why is it that it's not only a narrative, it's actually a reality? And the second question is, why is it that when prosecutions occur, sometimes they don't go anywhere? The other is, why are multinational corporations, especially the extractive industries in Southern Africa, so powerful in forming the narrative about who becomes a leader or who doesn't become a leader, and also in forming the economic agenda of a country? These are the sort of questions that when you dig deep, you'll find the roots of political corruptions occurring. And I think for me, the story really, with the situation now, starts with 1991 and the fall of the Iron Curtain of the Berlin Wall. Most African countries, especially in the South at least, were socialist economies. The reason for that is that they didn't want to be part of the capitalist agenda, because they were colonized by the capitalists. So they wanted to create a different narrative and a different economic agenda, a different model for themselves. But post-1991, things change, and the democratization phase started, and most of the countries had to adopt certain models. And the reason is that some of the infrastructure that were doing well in the 70s, 80s, started doing very badly in the 90s, well, started doing badly in the late 1980s. And as such, most of those governments were taken out of power because they were seen to be running down the economy. And as such, the democratization phase meant also the coming in of capitalism in most of these countries. But so what really happened in most of these countries? In 1991, between 1991 and 1993, most of these countries were forced to implement a program which is called the Structural Adjustment Program. Now, a number of conditions were attached to the Structural Adjustment Program. That is reduction on social spending, that is reduction on, for example, education, health, and other social incentives. The other thing is you had to devalue your currency and reduce the workforce. But the most important thing, which is also the telling impact of corruption to this very day, is that most of the countries were asked to privatize their public enterprises. So most of the mines were privatized, most of the industries were privatized. And unfortunately, the locals did not have the financial muscle to buy those companies. But then also what happened is that in order for the investment to come in, the law had to be sidelined. And what we then had were what were called development agreements. And these development agreements are still what we have now. Now, why is this very relevant, and what happened after that? This is relevant because when the new leadership came into power, we always say that they went into bed with the capitalist regime, with the people that now started running the different enterprises. And so you will find that whereas the law would limit the amount of land that a certain company would be given, most of those, especially in the extractive industries, they would get maybe twice or 3 times as much. I'll tell you now that there is a mining company in the northwest of the country which has a mine the size of Bahrain as a country, like the size of Bahrain. And they don't pay taxes. They say that they're always running at a loss. But when you look at the amount of trade, if you monitor the London Metal Stock Exchange, you find that there's a lot of money that they're making. But then when you try to engage with the political leadership, they'll say, yeah, but this is exactly what's happening. Then you try to do some investigation, you will find that the political leaders are running serious businesses with those companies. For example, they are the suppliers of stationery, they are the suppliers of water, they are the suppliers of different types of things. So they are gaining so much. Their trucks are transporting the copper out of the country. So they don't want the mining companies to go down because they're benefiting from those processes. And unfortunately, these are now contracts that you cannot have access to as members of the public. Why? Because us as lawyers, we're also guilty of the system, because when we draft these contracts, we embed the issue of of confidentiality, non-disclosure. So the public will not have access to these to these documents. The other dynamic to it is that they do not publish the full accounts. Why? Because the audit firms that help to run this are also in bed. They receive business from them, and the banks as well are in on it, because the banks have got secrecy laws. Now, this is also very important because one would ask, but isn't the legal system very strong to respond to some of these challenges? The legal system is not as strong. It's actually very weak. Why? Because when the laws are being dictated, the politicians are the ones that make the decisions, and they know that if they make strong laws, then it will catch up. It will catch up with them. So these are the sorts of challenges that that we have. I want to give you some facts. In 1991, when we had our first democratically elected president, Frederick Chiluba, he got into power. He was one of the leaders of the trade union movements, and at that time it was only the trade union movement was the only form of dissent against the the dictatorship that we had in most countries before 1991. So he was a trade union leader. So he was the only person that was known. When he came into power, the first thing that he did is he killed the trade union movement. At the time his term was running, we knew that he was, he had stolen so much and he was corrupt. So he tried to go on for another term, but that didn't work. So he said, okay, I'm going to be a political engineer. That's what he said. And he says that I'll be your president for a long time, but I'll have a proxy. And so he anointed someone we call President Manawasa, who became a leader. The first thing that the third president did was to start a prosecution against him, and the amount of money that was stolen was amazing, because remember I talked about the privatization process. The money that was supposed to have been generated from that process was not accounted for by anyone. And it was found that most of the money went in offshore accounts and so on and so forth. He was a president who was found with, I don't know how many shoes Imelda Marcos had, but he had more. He had trunks and trunks of shoes that were found, and he had over 9,000 suits, And these suits were tailored in London, tailor-made for him. How was he going to wear 9,000 suits? We had a situation where we had an airline. So the fleet of the airline, no one knows where it went. It just it disappeared from the airports, and no one knows where it went. We had so many other companies. And unfortunately, one of the things that we learned is that it was not only the executive arm of government that was involved in this sort of corruption. It was all the other arms of government. Because we found that the prosecutors who had started prosecuting the cases had sort of gained some traction and had found where some of those things were. But then they gave such a huge bill to the state failed to pay, and what happened is that they said, okay, we're going to seize these assets, some of the things that we have found to be owned by the states, and some of the properties were in London, across Europe. The other challenge that we found in the prosecution is that most of the corruption was aided by the multinationals, and some of the properties were offshore. But then we couldn't prosecute because as a government and as a country, we didn't have the jurisdiction to go against them. At the moment, we have what is called the yellow card campaign, where we're saying yellow card against corruption, because there are so many things that happened. I've run out of time, but let me just say very importantly now, we have an agency called the Financial Intelligence Center, which produced a report alleged that most of the political leadership were involved in so many corruption scandals. Unfortunately, now Parliament has a move to abolish that Financial Intelligence Center, and they want to absorb its functions and to be given to another institutions. The prosecutions that were supposed to occur have all been halted for lack of evidence and for lack of credibility on the part of this Financial Intelligence Center. So I think I've run out of time, but I had so much to say. I'll answer the questions.
I just have to say that I feel like I've been given the cruelest jobs. I would have liked to listen to all of you much. These are incredibly important and very detailed and very well explained stories. So I'm feeling really bad about this. And I have fun, but I have one more speaker, and I do want you guys to be able to come in. So I'm gonna, and Bergen Exchanges, we cut off on time. Mark, you get the final word from the panel. And thank you both.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And it was great to start with two countries with deep dives, both into the texture of what political corruption looks like in those two countries. I'm going to come at a different level. I'm speaking more in a personal capacity now. And as Lisa said, I've researched on corruption issues, and now I run an organization, which my elevator pitch for is a global organization for tackling corruption in the oil, gas, and mineral sectors. The funny thing is, actually, we haven't developed a very deep narrative around corruption, and in political corruption in particular. It's only recently we're now beginning to say, well, what exactly are the linkages? What is the contribution that we make to the struggle against corruption? It runs in the lifeblood of what we are in the 52 countries where we work. So whilst I manage an international secretariat in Oslo, each of the 52 countries has a secretariat. And our board and the multi-stakeholder groups in the 52 countries have government, companies, and civil society sitting around the table together, reviewing the data and the evidence around the revenues generated by companies from the extractive sector, how much they generate in terms of licenses, fees, taxation, and what in turn the governments say they receive. And we started out by essentially trying to identify what was the gap between the two. Over the 15 years or so since we've been established, we've increasingly got more and more granular, looking at, for example, questions of beneficial ownership, project-by-project reporting, and most recently in our new standard that sets the norm for how we do our work, contract transparency, which I believe potentially is a very powerful tool in the anti-corruption arsenal. Just to set this in context, over the 15-year period, we've actually worked with government, civil society, and companies to disclose $2.5 trillion worth of revenues from those three subsectors. So this is a huge part of the economy. Linking this, so we're now asking harder questions about what we do. We recognize a number of the countries that we operate in have suffered from significant corruption problems, and it's no surprise. We are here to really tackle some of the worst dimensions of the resource curse. As we know, natural resources in these sectors are a blessing in disguise. And it's no coincidence that many countries which had very substantial resources also happen to have very autocratic governments. And in the early days, post-independence days of countries which were nationalizing their resources, taking control, those were the heady days of generating significant revenues to promulgate the development of their countries. But very rapidly that soured. And increasingly you saw autocratic regimes coming in many countries in Africa, parts of Latin America, where essentially these resources provided a very steady stream of very substantial self-aggrandizement. It was for, essentially, as you said, not even public office, it was personal gain without public office. This was the pre-democracy period. I think something very interesting happened with democratization across many parts of the world over the last 20 to 25 years, because it's no longer exclusive access by dint of family or by dint of absolute control of state power. It now has to be negotiated. And yes, there are elections. We've heard of 2 countries which have been through an electoral process, albeit not perfect, but nevertheless an electoral process. There's a contestation now. And I think that brings in a very interesting new dimension. So it's no longer pure access to an unlimited stream of resources for personal gain. It's contestation over these resources. And some of the purposes to which it's put, sometimes directly through corruption, and you've heard about the Brazil case where it went very directly from oil through contracting companies and the benefits being filtered out through to political parties. That's quite unusual to have such a deep, detailed account of how the process really takes place. I think it's almost without exception. It's not only the biggest, it's probably the most public and the most detailed we have, I think, on the planet to date. So I would argue now that the motives behind control over state power in resource-rich countries is a more complex set of factors. Of course, there's still personal interest at stake. There is a lot of money still to be made for those who control the levers of state power. But there's also the distribution of benefits can sometimes actually serve a sort of balancing act. So it's not just the ruling party, it can actually be a shared resource to preserve a balance of political power across elites. So it's not just parties, but it's elite self-maintenance too. There's another part of this, which is parties which would claim to be acting in the national interest. In this era of democracy, how do we use resources to preserve national interests? So the language of preserving national interests can run alongside the practice of preserving political power and making money from extractors. So it's a very complex balancing act between these different sets of forces. Another factor here is the link between resource extraction, political corruption, and conflict. We haven't had a chance to talk much about the conflict dimensions of this, but again, the payoffs from natural resources can both be conflict enhancing, but also potentially conflict reducing if those in state power who wish to preserve relative peace to continue having a very significant level of extraction for political benefits. I think the big thing that's changed in the last 15 to 20 years is we now, and it links to our morning discussion, is we now have stronger institutions. The cases we've heard about in Zambia and Brazil partly came into the public interest because of a very active media, throwing light upon practices which in the past the media couldn't touch or wasn't simply in a form where it could begin to undertake such investigations. A more active civil society in both countries, and many countries which provide some level of countervailing power to an overarching state. So I would argue that the nature of the phenomenon has changed, even though what's at stake has not. And that the struggle over the resources is not a pure zero-sum game between you're in power and you get all the resources, or you're out of power and you don't. So I think one needs to understand the contestation that takes place over the resources in a sort of a new democratic dispensation. We see this play out in the EITI because we have this multi-stakeholder setup we have some of the countervailing institutions that provide checks on absolute state power. So to some extent, we can actually make some quite realistic arguments about how an initiative like the one we're engaged in provides part of the solution to addressing some of the most gross risks of abuse of state power and of the resource curse. And I would argue, actually, it was very interesting hearing about the subcontracting, which was so much at the heart of the Brazilian example that you've heard about. And it just reminded me again about the critical importance of contract transparency and having increasingly transparent subcontracts. We've heard examples in these two country presentations about how selective subcontracting through favoritism, of course, itself provides a certain level of access to those resources and a source of corruption as well. So we're asking ourselves these questions, and if you're interested to learn more, we have a paper on our website, the EITI website, where we're inviting comment, and we're about to revise that. We're asking, what is the role we can realistically play, we as the global EITI, in fighting corruption? Why haven't we managed as the EITI to prevent high-profile political corruption cases? And why is it that the disclosures we're engaged in don't fully expose the scandals that we've heard taking place in some of the countries we operate? And the big question for us is, what more can we do? What can we do differently, given the sort of modality we have as an extractives governance initiative? And part of this is finding ways that we can make, and this links again to the previous session, make more of the links we should have and do have to some extent with the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, the OECD integrity work, more work with other international bodies that are engaged in the corruption effort. And at the same time, we also need to deepen the links between the institutional setup we have through EITI with parts of government and institutions that are well placed to address in a more holistic fashion the anti-corruption effort. And I would particularly draw attention in that respect to working with those involved in public procurement, for example, some of the work of institutions which are trying to improve beneficial ownership, again a link to an earlier conversation we had today. So broad-basing work on extractives governance to work with a set of state institutions that in turn are held to account by a much more active civil society and media. And this is not a solution in its own right, but it's part of an effort to try and tackle this phenomenon which we've heard described in so much detail by our colleagues from Zambia and Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you again. I have one hand already, so I'm gonna take two questions. I don't know your name, you, and then Martha, and then we'll see how far we get. Okay? So you go for, okay, and then Amita. So I have three. Since I have a male panel, I'm going to have three questions from women. Doesn't that make sense?
Mainly women floor.
Try to be as quick as possible, then we have a chance. So it will be you, and then Martha, and then Amita. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So first, thank you for your panel. It was really interesting. From the first talk, I think it's clear how the anti-corruption discourse can be used politically, and I think in the Brazilian case was really clear. However, I wanted to maybe ask you to elaborate more on what you think could be the risks, the risks of this discourse internationally, because I think that from the Brazilian experience, we can see that these narratives and discourses can be really good because no one is pro-corruption. Nobody likes corruption. But at the same time, it can be really stigmatizing, especially for countries from the global south, although people are always talking about European companies. But when we think about corruptions, we are always talking about global south countries. And actually material effects, like, for example, anti-competitive, taking Brazilian companies from the competition internationally because they're not fit for business, or now that all the companies have been fined and they're being sold at a really low prices.
Excellent. Martha and then Amita.
Yeah, I'm going along more or less the same lines. I'm glad Conrado brought the image of Moro, Guinea, and Dallagnol giving a lot of lectures in American universities. And I want to, we are in an international audience, and I want to bring this point. During the whole process, there was a lot of support from American Academy to the operation. And Moro was even quoting a lot of American decisions that if you go to check them, sometimes they were exactly the opposite, going the opposite direction of what he was deciding. But there was this whole feeling that that he had national and international support. And I think, and just after the intercept leaking was released, there was immediately a Harvard professor saying, that was not so bad. That can happen, that was not so bad. And he was completely ignoring the fact that our model of criminal process is totally different from the American. In Brazil, we have a model that the judge has a lot of power, so there is not a jury. So he was the one who was himself deciding the case. It was not the jury. So he was completely forgetting the difference between the models. And I think that's very important for academic scholars and in goodwill that are, of course, anti-corruption, we ourselves are, but paying attention in the local realities. And I think we can say again that we can put this question to be an academic question, a kind of imperialism in anti-corruption agenda. And I think it's very important that we bring that up.
I'm going to ask you to give... Yeah, okay, it's going to be very quick.
I think also bringing the question of imperialism again is important because we are talking especially about natural resources. And what is happening now with these companies, they are being bought by international companies.
Excellent point. I'll put you in the panel next time. Perfect point, and really a contributor to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much to the panelists. This was a very, very rich and fascinating story, building up from what Martha was saying. So I think, any discourse on corruption as something that, can be fixed through various international and domestic measures, law, criminalization, to me is very simplistic because corruption is sort of structurally built in the way post-colonial societies, but also, we are seeing this in the developed world as well, is very much built within the fabric of how things are organized. And so I think corruption sort of comes from arbitrary power. And we find that, the story that you told about Brazil, a very similar story can be told in India. There, the person was not the prosecutor. There was someone at the Comptroller and Auditor General's office, which brought out the 2G scam. And, this person became very important in the media and discourse. And the same story, Harvard India Conference, etc., etc. And then, at the end of the day, we find that he's more sympathetic to the party that then came to power once the Congress was out. And now we find that the 2G scam was overestimated. And so it's a very, very similar story. And I think that the point that Martha is making is very important because the idea that we can fix these kinds of corruption in a very simple manner through these guidelines and through these normative frameworks, that's not how it works. Everything in the way the colonial society was organized was to favor the colonial power. And so there was arbitrariness and discretion that was built into every aspect. And many of these post-colonial societies, even though we have moved to democracy, we have some new institutions like a legislature and a parliament. But but most of our institutions are just continuities. Our bureaucracy, many of our models are very much the same as what was going on before, and the way they are used to functioning is very much how arbitrary power was organized in the colonial state. So to hope that, through anti-corruption movements and so on, we're going to fix anything, it just seems very simplistic and dangerous.
Thank you so much, Namita. So actually, there were 3 brilliant comments, but not really questions, so that gives you more freedom, and you have exactly 1 minute each. We have 3 minutes left. So basically, I'll have, you get 1 minute each just to sort of wrap up. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for the 3 comments. Multiple dimensions there, but I would also like to, to highlight one sort of mistake of the Lava Jato approach, which is a really simplistic approach to corruption as a problem of individual morality, of putting the bad apples into jail. Basically, this is, if not childish, this is really immature. The conditions for corruption in Brazil remain untouched. And these are related to the whole structures of incentives of political and campaign financing. So these remain untouched, if not worsened by the Supreme Court on the new and really, we modernize, we are not protecting. No, they did the opposite. They created a sort of ceiling that is proportional to the wealth of the person. So if I'm a poor guy, but I want to give 90% of my income to political campaign, I'm not allowed. If the richest man in the country, which is one of the 10 richest in the world, he can give 20% of his fortune, which is way more than my 90%, to political campaign. Well, this you know already what the consequences of this are.
Thank you so much. Lani?
I think I'll echo what he said, that the conditions for corruptions remain untouched. But I also think that from an African perspective, they're even growing much richer. And you find that a situation is occurring where we are creating a narrative of fighting corruptions and creating institutions that they are now becoming the camouflage for what is being fought. But behind the scenes, the scene of corruption is also growing. And I think one of the moves now has been to fight corruption at a continental level. And so we have the African Convention against on combating corruption. But you find that at the local level, there is nothing that is happening, and those norms are not being translated on the ground to fight corruption. But actually, the international stage is being used as the government's efforts to fight corruption, when in actual fact, nothing is happening.
Excellent point. So I felt the one thing that I haven't really delivered on was the happy story. So, with the 39 seconds left, it's all in your hands.
I am the optimist on the panel, because I do believe that most countries are capable of institutional innovation. I am the optimist. Most countries demonstrate themselves capable of institutional innovation, and I've described what some of those are. I want to actually just end on a happy note, which was I was in Stavanger about a week ago in the National Petroleum Museum, which is a fascinating place because what it does is it actually tells quite an honest story of oil in Norway. And one of the things I learnt about was how oil wealth in the first 2 decades in Norway created its own serious institutional problems. Norway had its own mini resource curse challenges, resulting in corruption-related problems in the early national oil industry. And so I suspect it would be very interesting to see and remind ourselves that this phenomenon is not simply one which arises in post-colonial societies, but actually arises in many countries which have unexpected windfalls from resource wealth. And I think the interesting story is, how did they learn from that? What institutional innovations did they pursue? And in turn, how did society gain as a consequence? So I think the happy story within certain limits here is actually a Norwegian story, and one that you can learn about just down the road.
Thank you so much. This has been a fantastic panel. I was very lucky to be able to chair this. Thank you so much. Let's give him a big round of applause. And we even got the happy note. Oh, wait.